Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rocking Chair Prophet interview. I'm Jack Beers, and I am alongside the author and now novelist, Matthew Kelly. Matthew, how are you doing today?
Good, Jack.
Really excited to be here and to break open the Rocking Chair Prophet. And I'm delighted to do that with you. I'm delighted you're all joining us. And I want to start with what was the number one question for me after reading the book. So there are lots of people who experience change or who are invited to experience change throughout this book. Some people say yes, some people say no, some people go through small changes, some people go through massive changes. But it's a novel. And it left me wondering, okay, it's a novel. Lots of people go through change. In real life, do people change?
I think it's one of the most important questions in human history, and maybe the better question is, can people change? Because I think a lot of people don't believe that people can change. I think a lot of people don't believe that people do change, and I think a lot of people have never really seen somebody change. I mean, in radical ways, but people do change. People can change, and I've seen that many times in my life. And I think it's important that we look for examples of that in our lives, because once we believe that people can change, all sorts of possibilities, I think, open up for us in just so many different ways.
In your study of history, in your experience with, many people, you were on the road for so many years, you met so many different people. Did you notice any patterns in the differences between people who do change and people who don't change?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you that incrementalism is the secret. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I think most people who change very significantly do it relatively quickly. I think we see that, let's say, with addicts. I've had a lot of experience in treatment centers, recovery centers, over the last 30 years. And there's something about recovering from an addiction doesn't work incrementally. And very often, whatever change that we're trying to pursue in our life, or whatever change we need in our life, we might not say, oh, I'm trying to recover from an addiction, but there's some of the same psychology or attachments to something that is preventing us from growing, and challenging us or inspiring us or forcing us to change. So I think if you need a big change, make a big change. Don't make 100 little changes. Get after it. Go make it happen.
What do you think changed for you? You believed probably for a while incremental growth. 5 years ago, you make the change. Why did you decide to look at it differently, or what caused you to think about it differently?
Yeah, so it's interesting because in the Dream Manager, I encourage people to make a list of 100 dreams. And even if they write them down and just put them in an envelope and stick it in a drawer and don't look at it again, it's amazing if they come back 3 years, how many of those dreams would have been accomplished, because there's something about putting it into the heart, the mind, the soul, the psyche, whatever it is. I don't claim to necessarily understand that. But they start to activate these dreams in their lives. But some of the biggest stuff we tend to put off. And we say, oh, I'll do that next year, or I do that next year. Oh, I'll do that, when the kids leave school, or when I retire, or, we have all sorts of things we tell ourselves. And I noticed over the last few years, like looking at my list of dreams over the last more than 25 years I've been doing this, that there are things that cannot be done incrementally. Many things can. Many dreams can be broken down, and you can say, okay, I'll do this piece of the dream now, and then I'll do this piece of the dream. There are some that just require a bold leap, and I think we know those ones in our lives. I think when change is needed, I think we lie to ourselves a lot. And we struggle to face the brutal truth about ourselves and the brutal truth about situations. And that prevents us from changing, I think.
Do you think it works in both ways? Do you think, we're talking about positive change, do you think that the downward slope when you start to move in the wrong direction in life, or an unhealthy direction in life, do you think that happens incrementally, or do you think that happens relatively quickly?
I think it happens much quicker than people think, and it can happen in an instant. I think we all know people who have made one choice, and it has redefined their life. It's a choice that they will never recover from. It's a choice that they will spend the rest of their lives trying to understand and make peace with. And it wasn't even necessarily a conscious choice. You know, they get caught up in something, and it might have been even an unintended consequence of something that they chose. So I think it can happen very, very quickly. And that sounds maybe negative or depressing, or I don't know what, but if that power is possible in that direction, I believe that power is possible in the positive direction. And I believe we see it happening in the negative direction a lot more than we embrace it or look for it in the positive direction.
Do you think change is inevitable?
Yes, but I don't believe progress is inevitable. So I think we are always changing. I'm different today than I was yesterday. Am I a better version of myself today than I was yesterday? Well, that isn't always necessarily true. And that's the problem, right? Because you can be changing, and activity is easily confused with progress. You know, people can be very, very busy and very, very busy wasting their lives. You know, people can be in a hurry and in a hurry to absolutely the wrong place.
You decided to focus in, it seems like, on this theme of change. Why the theme of change?
Because I really do believe that there are a couple of questions that define the human condition, that define human history. I believe the biggest question in human history is, who is my neighbor? And I would love to write a book about that one day, but I believe that is the question that defines the rise and the fall of every civilization, and you know, the direction of humanity at any given time. We believe an American life is more valuable than an Afghan life. We behave that way as a society, as a culture. We do not consider them our neighbors. And you don't have to go that far, you know. Things that we would not tolerate happening to our children or even our next door neighbor's children, we will allow to happen to someone's child on the other side of town. And it is a radical viewpoint. I realize that. The gospel is radical, and it is an expression of that radical teaching, that radical body of thought, that radical way of life that we're invited to. So I think two of the biggest questions in human history is, who is my neighbor, and can a person change? And so this one's about, in many ways, about, can a person change? I think I've written a lot of books over the last 30 years encouraging people to change, trying to inspire people to change, to have the courage to even look at the change that might be needed or desired. And yet I meet people very, very often, and I can tell that they don't believe that people can change. And we say it offhandedly in our culture, right? Oh, people don't change. We have to ask, is that true? Because if that is true, the consequences of that are pretty dire. If people don't change, then I mean, most of the people you meet, you'd write off straight away, right?
Yeah.
Because people don't change. And I just categorically reject that. And I wanted to encourage people to do the same and not to worry about can people change, because again, I think people are not that concerned about what is the meaning of life. We are concerned about what is the meaning of my life. And so the question isn't so much for the reader, isn't so much can people change, but can I change? And I want the reader to, I want to convince the reader that yes, you can, and that your tomorrows can be better than your yesterdays, and your future can be better than your past, and that your future doesn't have to be bigger to be better. In fact, that in many, many ways, your future will probably be better if it is smaller.
That draws me actually to the epigraph of the book about your future and what comes next. And you quote Isaiah, "Behold, I'm doing something new. Now it springs forth," which is Isaiah 43:19. And you're on this theme of change in the future, and it draws me to this line and to the question of, well, the Bible's a big book, and there's lots of references to personal transformation and change and progress and regression. So why this particular passage?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that the words are in God's mouth, they're not in my mouth. So it's not Matthew Kelly saying, I'm doing something new. Here's my novel. But the words in the mouth of God, that he is doing something new, and that he is doing something new in me and through me, but also that he wants to do something new in you. And are we open to that? Because the easiest thing in the world for me would be to write another nonfiction book. It's guaranteed to sell millions of copies, and to step away from that and do something new does require a trust. I think it does require a vulnerability. I think it does require an openness to fail, and I think that he wants to do new things in us. I think. And I want the reader I hope the reader will come away convinced that new things are possible, that they can change, that their future can be bigger than their past, and that he wants to do new things, amazing things in them.
When I experienced that passage, and even at the beginning of a book, it's like there's a strong part of me that experiences that line as the most hopeful line possible. That something new is possible. A new beginning is possible. A new way is possible. And then there's another part of me that experiences it as terrifying. It's like, well, I'm enormously comfortable. And there are parts of my life I would love to be new. And there are parts of my life that I look at and I'm like, well, it'd be terrifying if something new happened. What would you say to the reader that is experiencing more of the terrified of new things relative to the, oh gosh, I hope that something new is beginning?
Well, I think you've pinpointed what trips us up, and that is we want something new to happen here, but we want everything to stay the same here. And that doesn't work because you can't half open yourself up to something new happening. You're either open to something new happening or you're closed to something new happening. And if you're partially closed to something new happening, then you're completely closed to something new happening. And so I think to the person who's terrified of something new happening, I would say, like, what are you really scared of? Like what is really at stake? What is the worst outcome that's possible? And is that worst outcome really as bad as you imagine it to be? And what are the possibilities that you haven't even considered on the positive side of the ledger? Because when we get into that mindset, we do get into sort of a negative thinking place, and that sends us spiral down pretty dark, pretty quick. And the more it does, I think the more close we are to almost anything.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll answer that question with you off the line. I'm not sure. Not sure we're prepared to turn this conversation into, Jack's one-on-one counseling conversation with Matthew.
Oh, if that's what's needed.
Yeah. Let's open up the book. We just did the epigraph, but let's actually get into the book a little bit. And I'd love to hear from your perspective, just with the 100,000 foot view of the story actually is for the reader who's thinking about getting it or is about to open it up and is interested in learning more about the book.
Yeah, so I think you've got Daniel, and he is, a very successful guy in the world. He's married. He has, 2 wonderful daughters, and an unspeakable tragedy comes upon him in his life, and he becomes completely disoriented. Nothing makes sense anymore. Everything that he thought he could count on, everything that he thought his life was centered on, is imploded, and he has to rethink about who he is, what he's here for, what is life really all about, and how does he deal with this unspeakable grief, and I think grief is, it's love that has nowhere to go. And so he's in this place of just, absolute darkness. And from there, he has to work out, okay, where to from here? And he goes off into the mountains, and I think he's running away. I think he's probably running away from everything and everyone. Most of all himself, and of course that's not possible. So he ends up in this intimate encounter with self that really forces him to question the whole structure of his life and really the whole structure of modern society by extension. That's not part of the book, but that is essentially it. And in the midst of that, he develops what would be considered, I think, uncommon wisdom. But I think almost anyone who spent that much time in silence and solitude would develop that wisdom. And I think that's an important point that needs to be made. It's not, oh, he's special, he's God's favorite, he's different to all of us. And certainly then as he encounters people with his gifts, he is the first to say that. He is first to say, I can help you over this hump, but what's most important is you learn to find these answers for yourself going forward, and to listen to that voice that exists within all of us, and that we tend to discount and even ignore, I think, at different times in our lives.
It makes me wonder. We'll talk about the silence soon, but I want to go back to the first part, just tragedy. Reading it, and I read the first 20 pages, and I slammed the book shut, and I was, I'll leave to you as whether or not my face was dry or wet, but I was like, why tragedy? Why did you just do that to me? So why tragedy as the framework for this particular story, and what made you go to that place that, makes you emotional even, and you've spent so much time with the book?
We have a tendency to think that other people have it better than us. we have a tendency to think that other people don't have problems, other people don't have challenges, you know, and that, of course, is never true. Everyone is carrying a heavy burden, and so I wanted to create a construct where nobody could say, "Oh yeah, but he's better off than me from this point of view or that point of view, or he doesn't have this challenge, or he doesn't have this problem." I literally wanted to decimate the main character to a point where nobody could have that excuse, because I think we do use that excuse a lot.
Yeah. And I've read a few of your books, just a few, and there's a lot of lines I really like. But on this topic, and I've had the pleasure of writing with you a number of times, and I know how important the first sentence of a book is for you, and the first sentence of a chapter is, and then the first sentence of every paragraph. And you wrote, "You never really know who you are until you have suffered, really suffered. But once you know, you can never forget. And from that moment on, things you never considered become possible." Tell me about the process of deciding upon those lines.
Oh, so those opening lines, I mean, I rewrote the opening lines not less than 150 times. Agonized over it for months. Went through many, many, many different versions. I do think opening lines are very important. I think closing lines are very important. I think opening lines of chapters are very important, and closing lines of chapters are very important. I love words. I love phrases. I love ideas. It's about suffering, and I think we struggle to see the positive side of suffering. I think a lot of people have suffered. I think a lot of people have experienced horrific trauma. In many cases, they would not even acknowledge that they've experienced trauma, because the way our culture works is we tend to move on from things, or we tend to downplay, I think, the traumas that we do experience in life that are naturally a part of life, not because we've been greatly victimized or something like that, although that certainly does happen, but just because life is difficult, and life does involve a lot of suffering. But the paradox of suffering is that it changes the way you see things. It changes the way you see yourself. It changes the way you see other people. It expands, for example, I think, our empathy function significantly. And as a result of our suffering, things become possible that were never possible before. And we can miss that if we're very focused on the negative side of suffering, and even the lingering effects of that suffering once it's passed. I think we can miss the fact that it does make new things possible, different things possible. So that's why I settled there. I always struggle to think, okay, is that the right one? And even now I look at some of the others, not the whole 150, but there's probably 5 or 6 that I look at and think, make the right choice. I think I did, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think I had made a list of the greatest gifts that I've received in life. And that opening paragraph articulated perfectly one of the gifts I had tried so hard to communicate and put down on paper, but hadn't been able to. And it was the moment that somebody helped me see the possibilities that emerge through and post suffering, and the person who helped me to see the world and see suffering through the lens of possibility, like one of the 5 greatest lessons and gifts of my life. So that line to me You can't, it has to be the right line because it gave words to me for things that I've been trying to say for 20 years. So
I'm glad.
Yeah. And I'm not that old. I think I've been saying that for 20 years.
No
right?
doubt.
So, all right. I want to get into why I was excited to do this interview with you. I always enjoy spending time with you, but I'm really excited to dive into some of the characters. So for those of you who haven't read the book, there are a number of different people that Daniel encounters throughout the book in individual one-on-one context, and then in actual group circumstances throughout the book. And there are so many astonishing lines and incredible lessons, some that resonated less with me, that would resonate a lot with other people. So I'm the one doing the interview, so I get to talk about the people I'm most excited about.
Sounds fair.
And so I want to start with my favorite character, who is Daniel's friend, named Ezra, but not just Ezra alone. Part of what makes Ezra so great is that he's paired up with his wife, Leah. And there's this great scene in the book where Ezra, he decides to pursue a lifelong dream that had been dormant. And the end of the chapter, you wrote, when he woke that morning, Ezra never could have imagined that his life would change so magnificently in a single day. Which is a great line and speaks to the beginning of our conversation. And then the very next line to open the next chapter is his wife saying loudly, "What have you gone and done?" And I love this exchange because it's not what emerges out of it is it's not a nagging, Ezra, what have you done? But it's I feel obligated to give you a hard time about this, but I have never been more in love and never respected you more than now that you've decided to take that leap. So can you speak a little bit into this interaction and a little bit into the relationship between Ezra and Leah and kind of how that played out there?
Yeah, so I think the end of that chapter, we don't recognize the most significant moments in our lives when they're happening, for the most part. And we don't realize when we're in the pits of despair or on the pinnacle of victory how quickly and devastatingly life can change. And so that is what that last line in that chapter is encapsulating, that your life can change and change significantly in a day. And magnificently in this case. The opening of the next chapter, it's very playful, it's very joyful. They have Ezra and Leah have, what I think is a phenomenal relationship. And it is a relationship with a lot of humor. I think it is a playful relationship, but it can be very serious. And I think they give each other permission to hold each other accountable, and I think that's a beautiful and necessary thing if people are going to grow. We live in a culture that is, in many ways, allergic to accountability. I think the idea of a husband and wife holding each other accountable, I think there's a lot of people would have resentment about that. But I think it is critically important to a really vibrant and healthy and dynamic relationship, and they have this. And so when she says, Ezra, what have you gone and done? It is both playful and she shares his excitement, but it is also, okay, do you realize what you're doing here? Because what you're doing affects me a great deal, and And so it's all of those things. And I think Leah is an amazing woman, a fantastic woman. I think Ezra's a great guy. So I would say Ezra is probably my favorite character in the book. I think he was the easiest to write. I think in many ways, Ezra is my father. You know, the inspiration for Ezra comes from my father, although that was not the intention. I only after the book was printed and I had it in my hands and I read it as a finished product, did I even recognize that? And that's how unconscious we are about many of the things we do in life.
Yeah. And I think it was, I didn't realize it until now, but that last line of how magnificently your life could change is in direct contrast to how awful your life can change in a single day with Daniel.
Yes.
And you know, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, right? And it plays out in both of these moments that are of significance to both of these men.
Yes.
Which is powerful. And then with Leah, you know, I hadn't thought about it this way, about dreams. You know, list a number of things that are really great for an individual when they pursue their dreams, the benefits of pursuing your dreams. And I hadn't thought about it until I read this book, that it animates love between two people. When one is pursuing a dream and the other is with them along for that journey, it fosters and flourishes love, yes, which is a beautiful thing.
Yes.
Did you intend to communicate that?
I think for me, like, dreams animate us as human beings, and I've written a lot about that. I think it makes a person very, very attractive when they're pursuing their dream. So the opposite is probably also true. When someone stops pursuing their dreams or gives up on their dreams or falls into whatever that state is, I think that's probably very unattractive to our partners. And but the other thing is that we have a responsibility, I think, to encourage each other to dream, to be curious about each other's dreams. You know, in the Dream Manager, I wrote that most people get into bed every night with somebody and they have no idea what their dreams are, what their vision is for their life. And very often when we are, let's say, dating, we take an interest. We're curious about that person's vision for their life because, really, from a selfish point of view, it's does that vision work with my vision? Are these visions going to work together? Mistake we make is that their visions change, just as our vision changes over time. Our dreams evolve and change, and if we don't know what they are, we certainly can't support them in them. And I think Leah's support of Ezra in this dream is striking and is life-giving to Ezra, but it was also life-giving to Leah and to their marriage.
Yeah. And he yearns as the man in many ways to look at his wife and have her say, yeah, you're capable. You know, wish we would have talked about it, but you are capable of this. You know?
Yes.
Well, I would talk about Ezra all day, but I want to move to a chapter called Midlife Crisis, because it's really rich and it has a lot of lessons that extend beyond midlife. Midlife is sort of the point to draw the wisdom out, but it applies to so many different things. And Daniel has a conversation with a man named Jacob, and he basically comes and sits in front of Daniel and says, well, I've got a midlife crisis. Can you help me with that? You know? And Daniel says a couple of really important things that I want to talk to you about. And the first is this inner conflict you are experiencing has a purpose. It's helping you to discover your unrealized potential. I wrote next to this, how would the world be different if we all experienced inner conflict as having a purpose to help us fulfill our unrealized potential? I feel like it would change everything, no?
Yes. I think that so much of what we experience as human beings that we perceive as being negative, we also perceive as human malfunction. So there's a chapter about depression, and the idea that when someone's depressed, well, we think they're malfunctioning, and the complete opposite is true. When we experience a depression, it's a sign that everything in this very intricate being is working to say, hey, you got a problem. Think about what the problem is. Think about what's causing the problem. And we can ignore it. We can push through it. And the same here. So Jacob has this inner conflict, as we all do from time to time. And the danger is to say there's something wrong with me. I'm malfunctioning. When the reality is that your very intricate self is drawing attention to something that is critical to a more expansive future, a better version of yourself, whatever it is you want to call it. And I love that chapter as well. I think just the way that Daniel talks to him about, okay, is it a midlife crisis or is it a midlife opportunity? And why do we choose crisis? I mean, it's a fairly common experience, maybe a universal experience. And one thing Daniel says is, like, if you sit there for 3 minutes and say, just repeat the word crisis, 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 you will feel a certain way. And if you sit there for 3 minutes and you repeat the word opportunity, you will feel a very different way. And of course, we are doing this to ourselves every day. There are words and phrases and ideas that we are repeating to ourselves over and over and over every day. And they're having very real impact on the way we live our lives, the way we see ourselves, the way we see other people, the way we perceive relationships and participate in relationships. Everything, right? I mean, just everything. So, I think it is a very important chapter, because it also is a chapter that marks sort of a shift in the book, of sort of a new phase in Daniel's life, where he is starting to share this wisdom that he has received with other people, and this is such a universal topic that it just felt like the right place to start.
Yeah, and I really appreciated the bluntness of Jacob in it as well, because Daniel has a lot of wisdom, but Jacob has the courage to push and to press into it, and he asked this great question. It's like, what's the biggest mistake I can make? And Daniel says, during times of our inner turbulence, we are drawn to the distraction of external activity. The midlife experience is an interior experience. Resist the temptation to look for external solutions to this internal dilemma. And I, especially in modern America, especially with all of the things that we have at our fingertips, not the least of which is a cell phone, the idea of turning to external experiences to distract, numb, or replace the time and attention on internal, it just is so enormous. And it feels like that piece of information, that sort of wisdom, to focus on the interior, is a big part of this book. Can you speak to your emphasis on the interior experience of life?
I think the poverty of our interior lives has increased significantly over the last 20 years. I think the cell phone has played a very damaging role in that. I think that there used to be these moments, I call them the gaps in the day, where you would stop at a stop sign or a stoplight. You would stand in line at the grocery store. You would sit in the waiting room in a doctor's office. These moments in our lives that would turn us within, would foster some sort of interior reflection. We have developed a reflex in all of those situations where we now take out our phone. And so these interior moments where we should be developing real clarity about who we are and what we're here for and the choices that are before us and how we should approach them, these interior moments have been stolen from us. And not like one or two, but all of them. And it now requires very real intentionality to say, I am going to have an interior moment. I am going to reflect on my life. I'm going to reflect on who I am as a person, who I'm capable of becoming as a person. These natural moments have been kidnapped by the cell phone, and I think we are individually poorer for it, and as a society, I think it's contributing to our, to something that is teetering on bankruptcy.
I had my 3-year-old take my phone away the other day. Daddy, no more phone. And it's true, like no more. I walk into the house. What do I need my phone for? Right. It's hard though. Yes. It's really hard.
Yes, it is.
I'll move to another one. We can keep going on that particular one. But I want to move to a new one, and it's a woman by the name of Melissa Mayer. She's a reporter, and she exploits the story. She sensationalizes and exploits the sensationalization that she helps create to exploit Daniel. And she comes back to him and confronts him and looks to reconcile. And she's really actually hoping that Daniel will be angry with her, that she will feel better if he's angry with her, and he refuses to.
Yes.
He's extremely gracious. And they have this exchange where she goes to leave. And Daniel says, wasn't there something else you wanted to ask me? And she says, there was, but I can't. It doesn't seem right after all I put you through. And Daniel reminds her, that is your guilt, preferring punishment over transformation. Guilt getting in the way of transformation. Do you think that's a common theme in our world today?
Oh, absolutely. Guilt seeks punishment. And in a culture where ethics and morality has been dismissed en masse, people might try to pretend that they don't feel guilty about all sorts of things. But in those quiet moments when they are alone and it is quiet and they are confronted with the self, they very much do feel guilty for some of the things they've done. And with the rejection of religion, people don't know what to do with that guilt. And so what we see in society is we see people seeking out punishment unconsciously for things that they have done, because that is how it's just one of the distorted ways that guilt tries to find a way out of our system. We do some things that are right, and we do some things that are wrong. There are many things that are in the gray zone, and it's hard to say and whatever else, but there are some things that we absolutely know are not our best nature, are not in our best interest or in other people's best interests. And this is what Melissa has dealt with. But I think the other important thing to recognize is that Daniel recognizes she was driven by ambition, and that we are all driven by ambition at different times, and that ambition is aggressive. It is a form of aggression, and it is at the very least careless sometimes, and sometimes it's reckless. And ambition has a mind of its own. And in this case, Melissa's ambition was she sees this opportunity for this story. And in order for the story to really create a pivotal moment in her career, she has to dehumanize Daniel. And she knows that, and she does that, and she does that knowingly and willingly. And because she is ambition's prisoner, she is like overtaken by this opportunity and the ambition that seeks to take full advantage of that opportunity. And Daniel basically says, hey, like, I knew what you were doing even when you didn't know what you're doing. I knew what you were doing because I did it myself. And I think that's part of Daniel's power, is that not saying he's better than anybody. He's not saying he has all the answers. He's not morally or ethically judging anybody or anything. And he is very much in touch with his own limitations, the mistakes he has made in his life, and the regrets he has about the way he's conducted himself in the past and how that has affected other people. And so that self-knowledge, that awareness, that emotional intelligence allows him to have what I think is a heroic level of empathy for Melissa, and much more than empathy, a real desire to want what is good for her, to want whatever it is that helps her make the next step in her journey, and works through this guilt that really she is paralyzed by, in a sense.
I also experienced it as a rejection of eye for an eye, and the philosophy that, you know, someone does something to me and it justifies me doing something back to them. And what I felt this exchange highlighted is that doesn't elevate anybody, and that Jesus' way of doing things and his method of thinking through things elevates other people. And Daniel is literally turning the other cheek and rejecting the eye for the eye.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's a really interesting perspective. And then, like, what I'm thinking about as you say that is like what makes that possible? What has happened in Daniel that makes it possible for him to step back from that paradigm? And of course, if you have two people equally possessed by ambition in the same situation, that is certainly not going to be the outcome. And yeah, that's a really interesting insight.
I think we just see it every day in our current politics, right? Like, the current political spectrum is so rooted in eye for an eye. And then you experience something like this, and it's so refreshing. You don't have to punish each other. And it really struck me. And I think that's why, part of the reason why I found that this particular chapter so moving and interesting, because it didn't have to be in here, but it was put in here, and I think wisely so, because I know times in my own life that I've preferred punishment over transformation. I know times in my life in which my forgiveness has elevated other people and other people's forgiveness has elevated mine. So I'm grateful you put that one in there. I want to go back to Ezra, if we can, because I think it touches on something that you had shared earlier about who's my neighbor. Daniel says something powerful to him. They're having an intimate conversation. It's in chapter 23. And it's after a long day, and they have these wonderful, intimate exchanges when Daniel really relaxes. And he says, throughout history, most problems have been caused by a single idea, the idea that some people are different. which is a big and powerful statement. And in the context of such a divisive culture, why'd you put it in the book?
Yeah, I think it is. I think in many ways the book is a book about the human condition. I think it is about many of the common struggles that we experience. I think that we very easily other people. And what I mean by that is we're very quick to put people in other categories. They're other than me because of this, and they're other than me because of this, and this is my group or my family or my whatever, and these people are other than us because of A, B, and C. It's this othering that I think is very divisive and prevents us from seeing our common humanity. And but at the same time, like, I understand it, like there's real reasons. Like the world is a scary place. The world is a dangerous place, you know, and for our ancestors, you know, out on the savannah, like, yes, like, be aware, you're in danger, and you're in danger every moment of every day. And it might be another person, it might be a lion, and who knows what it is. But so there are real reasons that we do have these ways of functioning, and these ways of sort of categorizing and even judging and putting people in certain boxes. But I think we've moved to a place in so many other ways that we still remain, I think, fairly remedial in some of these psycho-spiritual aspects of the way we live, the way we see ourselves, the way we see other people, and the way we participate in society.
I just never thought that it was as destructive as you describe. How do you think it comes across as so subtle? You know, it doesn't strike me as soon as I hear it, like, oh, for sure. And when you describe it, it's like it makes sense, but it seems subtle and innocuous, seeing someone as other.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to protecting what we perceive to be ours. You have a fence in your backyard?
I do.
So we all do, right? And then we have these borders that we erect to say, okay, this is mine, I'm going to protect what's mine. And then this is our country, so this is ours, and those people over there, well, this is not their country, and so they should whatever, but this is our country. And so it just goes on, and it happens geopolitically, it happens, of course, religiously, between religions, it happens between clans, it happens, it just happens. But it doesn't have to happen, because we do see it, we do understand it, we can change it. We can change.
And we don't have to treat each other that way. Last one, I want to keep going through all of them, but last one on the characters and the themes, because the book covers, I mean, if you can think about a topic, it's in the book. You know, it talks about money, it talks about things, it talks about depression, it talks about friendship, and it talks about love. And Daniel is in this coffee shop, and someone asks him about love, and he says this: falling in love comes with feelings of forever, but feelings are unreliable and unsustainable. Any relationship based on feelings alone will therefore be unreliable and unsustainable. Feelings by their very nature are fleeting, and so any effort to make the in love phenomenon last is doomed to fail. Our desire to make something last forever that will inevitably end is a delusion that leaves us unprepared for a sustainable relationship. So you have that, and then you have Hollywood love stories, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to put on the table is that probably took me 100 hours to write that paragraph, you know, and to vet that paragraph and to sit with that paragraph and say, okay, is this true? In what instance could this be not true? But yes, you have, I think, the presentation of love in our culture as something that should feel good. And that's a lie. I think we're confused about what the purpose of love is. I think we're confused about what love is. And even at fundamental levels, and at fundamental level, if you ask people what is love, they would speak about romantic love. But if we're talking about the human condition, if we're talking about the existence of humanity on the planet, if we're talking about society, you know, love is to will the good of the other. And I don't need to like you to love you. And I think that from a religious perspective, people get confused. Because if love is a feeling, then in order for me to love my neighbor, and really everybody is who Jesus says is our neighbor, then I have to feel good about you. And that's just not possible, right? There are going to be some people you don't like. That's just life. That's just humanity. But you can love them. You can desire good things for them. You can will the good of the other, because we are rational beings. You know, we're not just body and feelings and instincts, but we do have will and intellect, and we can use our will and intellect to direct our thoughts and behavior, and love at its best should involve that. Maybe it should even be that.
Love is such a broad topic.
Yes.
And you take it on in a couple of different places, but in this one, you talk about feelings and you talk about what love is. So all the ways that you could talk about love, why those two things?
Well, so, you know, what's happening is people are coming to visit with Daniel, so this set the scene. And, you know, Daniel realizes there's a storm coming. And so he basically says to Ezra, let's get these people down the coffee shop. I'll come down the coffee shop and I'll meet with people there. And then this is really the only instance throughout the first 90% of the book where he meets with a group of people. Usually he's meeting with people one-on-one. And so there's this packed coffee shop, and the conversation is love. And he is trying to talk about the basics of love, the fundamentals of love, the universality of love. And all of the questions drag him toward romantic love. And so there's this wrestle, this back and forth between, okay, are we talking about romantic love? That's fine. But in order to understand romantic love, you have to understand the basics, the fundamentals, the universality of love. And of course, in this case, particularly the young people, they keep dragging the conversation back to romantic love. And I think that back and forth is very real. I think it's very real in our lives. I think it's very real in society. I think it's one of my favorite scenes. Because I think the scene is very rich. I think I can smell the coffee. You know, I can smell the cinnamon in the oatmeal raisin cookies, and I can smell the apple cake. And I just something about that scene.
I felt.
I don't even drink coffee.
Yeah,
you know.
I felt the dampness of the rain on this one when you find rescue in a place. I want to. Now that we're this far into the interview and it's been very amicable and all this stuff, I'm ready for my beef with you.
Good.
And the book.
Good. Bring it on.
So Daniel, he goes through this big tragedy and this big change, right? And you get to the book, get to the end of the book, and you don't resolve it for me.
Mm.
And instead, you anticipate another change.
Mm.
And it's like, hasn't this guy been through enough?
Mm.
And he's going to go through another big change. What's up with that? Why did you decide to have him go through another big change? And doesn't he just deserve some peace and some quiet for a bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I designed the book, it was designed as part of a series. It is the first book of what I envisioned to be 3 books.
Oh, that was my last question. So it is a series.
So you have that one covered.
Nice.
And I think the point of, toward the end of the book, he's definitely, he's getting restless again, right? And he is being called to another change. Whether or not he will follow that is obviously unresolved.
That's my cliffhanger.
And you're uncomfortable with that because we like all things like neatly tied up. But, but the reality is that I think a real contentment in life is being comfortable, being uncomfortable. I think is recognizing that some things are unresolved, some things will remain unresolved, some things will take time to resolve. In this case, he is being confronted with himself again. I think he is being summoned by himself to come out of what has become a comfortable place. And he experiences these comfortable places. He's in a very comfortable place with his wife and his daughters. Ultimately, he ends up in a very comfortable place, living in the mountains, in this dirty, damp little cave with nothing of this world. But he becomes very comfortable with that. He becomes very at peace and very contented with that. He is, in a sense, forced out of that. I don't think of his own, volition, he would have necessarily woken up one day and come out of the mountains. Mm. And then, in this case, in the case you're referring to, toward the end of the book, he's gotten comfortable again, and he's being called not to worship comfort, and to continue in his journey, which he can say yes to and he can say no to.
I think what I like about that description, well, first of all, I feel way better knowing that there's more. So my beef it's moved down to chicken, so it's lessened. What I like about that, though, is that you talk about there being seasons of change, but there are also seasons of comfort.
Yes. So
the book doesn't necessarily put a definitive amount of time. There's sort of like some sense of time passing, but It's not like, hey, it was 10 years or 3 years or 1 year or 1 week, But there was a season of comfort. So there are seasons of comfort, is what you're saying, and there are seasons of change.
Yeah, and I think I would probably describe it maybe as contentment. If we allow ourselves to experience them, and very often I think in modern society we don't allow ourselves to experience contentment. I think in our glorification of activity and achievement, and even our glorification of busyness, I think we rob ourselves of the very simple pleasure of contentment, of having enough and being enough, and enjoying that, and just sort of settling into that. I think we struggle with that.
Yeah, for sure. The last theme for this book that I wanted to touch on is, it's been important for you throughout all 37 books that you've written. And 30 years in being and writing and speaking, listening to the voice within you. And it is a strong theme within. Daniel's constantly coaching people on how to listen and respond to the voice within them. For someone who is looking to try and engage with the voice within for the first time, what advice would you have for them?
I think firstly to recognize how many voices there are in your life, to recognize the influence those voices have over you. And the myriad. Yes, there's the voices of friends and the voices of your husband or your wife or your kids or your parents, the voices of your siblings, but there are voices from long ago and far away. There are voices of your soccer coach when you were 7 years old, or your football coach, or your fifth grade teacher, or your dead parent who's been dead for 20 years and is still, the voice is still there, So there are a lot of voices in our lives, and until we learn to listen to the voice within, we are addicted to these external voices. And there's enormous insecurity about not being able to provide for yourself in this way. And so how many sort of scenarios where people are manipulated and deceived is rooted in, I am the only one with the answers. You have to come to me with the answer, or you have to come to me for the answer, and, it can happen with all sorts of people, right? It can happen with a boss. It can happen with a life coach. It can happen with a therapist. It could happen with a friend. It could happen with a spouse. It could happen with a parent. It can happen. Lots and lots of people can occupy, invalidly occupy that place in our lives. And then we feel like, okay, without that person, I can't really make a decision. We have to be liberated from that in order to take the onward journey. It doesn't matter who we are. It doesn't matter what the onward journey is. And so how do we start? Silence, solitude. People want it to be difficult. People want you to say, well, you got to do this, you got to do this, and these are the other 14 steps. It isn't like that. If you will get comfortable, learn to be comfortable in silence and in solitude, it will just happen. And I think the more time you are willing and able to spend in that silence and solitude, the more you'll get to know yourself, the more comfortable you will become in your own skin, in the choices you make, and in your ability to take the next step in your life. Of course, we live in a culture that is just so noisy. There's just so much noise. The idea of a quiet place, like, where are the quiet places? And where is your quiet place? Or where are your quiet places? And how easy or difficult is it for you to go and spend time in that silence and solitude? Because I think that alone says an awful lot about how healthy we are in almost every respect at different points in our lives. There are times when I do not want to spend time with myself. That says something, and it also is a prelude, probably, to me doing something pretty stupid. You think about relationships, you think about dating, which, like, young people are obsessed with this right here. And so many people end up with the wrong person, like the absolute wrong person, not like, maybe I'm wrong. No, absolutely. So many people end up with absolutely the wrong person because they're not comfortable being alone. So So they have to be with somebody, and that is, I think, one of the great tragedies is that we are not taught to learn to enjoy our own company. Not in a narcissistic way, but in a very healthy self-discovery.
Yeah. It's one of those things that until you do it, you don't know how good it is.
Yes.
And I think that's what can be challenging about it, the intimidation factor up front. And even I remember the first time I was in silence for 15 minutes, it felt like 4 hours.
Yes.
But once you get into it, it becomes, I now yearn for it. I think once you get into it, you start yearning for it. And so what would you say to somebody who's in that first part, in that sort of like difficult first part, when they're first getting to experience themselves in silence?
I think it is the ultimate life discipline. I think it is absolutely excruciating in the beginning. You describe 15 minutes feeling like 4 hours. I think that's real. I think to think of it as a muscle that you want to strengthen. If you can only do it for 1 minute today, great. Set a timer tomorrow and do 2 minutes. Mm. And if you can only do 2 minutes a day for the next year, great. And then 3 minutes. But the more you expand the period of time that you're able to spend in silence and solitude, the more every single thing in your life will improve. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that will not benefit from that. And that's hard to believe. And, you know, as I often say to people about many, many things, you don't need to believe me. You know, investigate your doubts. And the only way to investigate your doubts here is to try it. And as you say, once you do it, you realize, wow, how did I live without this? And you do yearn for it. But there are still days when you will resist it, even though you know it's the best thing for you. Sure. There are still some days when it will be excruciating because of what's happening in our outer world is so distracting sometimes to the inner world that we can't. But that's when we need it the most. And I think it's also important to recognize that. Yeah.
I remember this one period when I had been doing the silence and was away from it for a while, and I came back to it. And I remember like a month into it, a coworker coming to me and being like, "Hey, what's different about you? Like, you're a lot more pleasant these days." 15 minutes in the morning.
Yep.
So the book goes through every one of the essential aspects of what it means to basically flourish as a human being, like friendship, spirituality, money, relationships, love, dreams, purpose, prayer, lots of stuff. And I found myself going back to it. So there was a decision that my wife and I needed to make. It was in the financial world. And I was like, oh, I remember there's something in Rocking Chair Profit about money. And I let me go look at it, and I looked back and I read it, and then we talked about it. And did you design it that way? Is that what you hoped the book would do for people? That it would be something people would come back to in a way that's different than other books that you've written?
Yes. I think that some of these messages can't be absorbed just by reading the story, but you can be reminded at other times that they are there, you know? And I think the great hope is that someone will read the book, someone else will be experiencing something, and they will say, not you need to read this book. You need to read the chapter on whatever it is. And I think that the chapters can be consumed in that way, that they can be very helpful in that way. The story is just to give it, I think, a context.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is your first novel. I opened it up with Matthew Kelly, author, now novelist. You've dabbled in the world of parables in the past. This is your first novel. Why a novel? Why a story now?
I think it's, I've wanted to do it for 20 years. You know, I have a couple of unpublished manuscripts in the area of fiction that I've worked on at different times over the past 20 years. I feel some sort of guilt about spending time on this. It feels less serious. It feels less important. I know that not to be true, but that is certainly a feeling that I have had over the years when I've sat down to work on it. And then finally, I just decided, you know.
You didn't let guilt stand in the way of transformation any longer.
I was trying not to.
Yeah.
I was trying not to.
Fiction has a power that nonfiction does not, in terms of piercing, breaking through a barrier. You know, I think that nonfiction has certain powers that fiction does not, because it you know, it's right there, it's direct. But it seems like the more and more distant a person is from spirituality, from the inner life, from taking the inner voice seriously, the more relevant and important a novel is to that person's life, because it actually contains within it the opportunity to break through a hardened heart and reach someone who otherwise wouldn't be reached by nonfiction. Did that cross your mind as you're writing it? What are your thoughts on the power of story in that way?
So I think that is absolutely true. Although interestingly, I think it's equally true for the person at the other end of the spectrum you described. Because I think we can become very sure of ourselves. I think we can convince ourselves that everything is just so, and that we understand things. And the reality is that as human beings, we do have preferences, we do have biases, we do have prejudice, and story has the power to cut through these things. Story has the power to sneak beyond prejudice and bias and personal preference and convince us of a truth, and then come back from behind enemy lines and say, might want to rethink that one. I think nonfiction can have a habit of confirming our biases, our prejudices, our personal preferences, probably because we only read nonfiction that affirms much or most of what we already believe to be true.
Yeah, that's change in thinking. When you talk about it like that, change in the way I think, novels have done that. How to live in a particular way when I'm seeking a particular topic. Nonfiction has helped me do that, but shifted my perspective and changed the way I think. Novels have always done that. There's sort of there's a bizarre, relaxed openness to new ideas in that context.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have a friend who's in the area of psychology, and he told me once that when he was teaching, students would come to him and ask him, like, what books should they study in order to become great psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists or that type of thing. And he always told them to read the classics, to read literature, because that's where the mess of humanity is. And you won't find that in nonfiction in the same way. And I thought that was a very, very astute insight. And I think it says something about the importance of these things in education, and how literature is being, I think, deprioritized in our children's education is in and of itself a dehumanization.
Yeah. Just finished my first round of Dostoevsky. There's a lot of humanity there.
A lot of humanity there.
A lot of humanity. Okay, I want to finish with this. I want to finish with the title. Why rocking chair and why the word prophet?
So originally the book was just called The Prophet. The book was very, very loosely inspired by Khalil Gibran's poetry, really, The Prophet, where he just has these one page on these different topics. So originally the book was going to be called The Prophet. I ultimately realized that that was problematic because there are a number of books out there by that title. And I also felt like danger that would be seen as an overly religious book, which it isn't. And then the rocking chair is, I think it evokes images in people's lives. I think it evokes a way of life in people's minds. I think it makes people think and feel things. There's something relaxed about it. And there's some very serious things that are dealt with in the book. And yet there is something very relaxed about it. So I think that's ultimately, how I came to that. Obviously, the rocking chair becomes a very important part of Daniel's life, and a way of connecting with people. And of course, he inherits the rocking chair from Charlie. We didn't talk about Charlie, but I think Charlie is another fabulous character. I think he's another one of these great mentor, teacher, sage, wise type figures that we all need in our lives, and that unfortunately are becoming too rare in our society.
Yeah. Matthew, thank you for writing The Rocking Chair Prophet and for clearing up my my fear that it was a one and done.
I'm glad we could help.
I'm glad you could help as well. And grateful for the time here as well. And if you are watching this and you're sitting there being like, what are you doing? How could you not have asked about Charlie? How could you not ask about any one of the characters? By all means, in the comment section below, please ask your question to inquire at a deeper level. Perhaps you're burning to know what happens with Sophia and what was behind Sophia or any of the other characters. Please do ask your questions in the comment section below, and I'm sure Matthew's going to have some fun with those questions. Until then, enjoy The Rocking Chair Prophet.